Okay, so this is some audio support for MD6030 assessment 1. So the assessment is to produce and present a poster discussing a single infectious disease. We've provided a list of infectious diseases on the module space, and the idea is you pick a single one of those infectious diseases, one which is of interest to you, and then you produce your poster based upon that infectious disease. I'm aware some of you have started the poster, which is great, which means it's a good time for me to kind of provide some support. So what I basically want to do in this recording is answer some of the questions that I think you may have, give you the core bits of information you need to get started and to make some progress, and also talk through some examples of good posters from previous years. So one resource students find really useful is examples of posters, particularly if you haven't made a poster before. So it can be a bit you're not quite sure what direction to go in, you're not even sure where to start sometimes. So looking at a good example of a poster that other students have made can be a good starting point, because it at least gives you something to aim for. So we're going to look at two posters today. The first one is on latent Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So this is one of the infectious diseases provided on the list in the module space. This was produced by a student last year. So what I essentially want to do is spend a few minutes looking at this poster, talking about why this was one of the best. It was certainly in the top band in terms of grades, and I kind of want to I want everyone to understand why this is a good poster, and also understand why it's not a perfect poster, because it's not a perfect poster. Basically, the first thing you'll probably notice is that it looks good. It's clear. It looks like there's been some thought put into it. It's been thoughtfully composed. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's not ugly. It's not it's not a mess. Everything has its place and it looks quite clear. A lot of this is due to the colour scheme. So some students will make the mistake of picking random colours for different parts of the poster. What you end up then is it just looks a bit horrible. It doesn't look good. And most posters, basically, it needs to look good if you want to get a high mark. The idea is we're replicating a conference environment, and in a conference you want people to approach your poster, you want them to engage with the poster, and if it doesn't look good, if it looks confusing or just looks ugly, people probably aren't going to go over and have a look at it. So one thing you need to give thought to is the colour scheme. Generally it's a good idea if you pick a colour and then you base the colour scheme of the poster around that colour. So this student's gone for green, and most of the poster is shaded in various shades of green, and that works well. And whatever colour you pick, if you try and use various shades of that colour, generally the poster will come out looking pretty good. We get you're not graphic design students, and that's totally fine. We just want it to look not offensively bad. Basically, you want it to look just neutral, just look okay, look fine. So this student's gone for green, and we have these 3 different shades of green, and it looks good. You can imagine if it was bright pink in some parts, then bright yellow in others, then kind of bright green in others. It would be visually it'd be a bit of a disaster. Basically, it'd look horrible. So that's what we want to avoid. Just in terms of the composition of sections as well, it looks good. So we have these clear titles. The poster itself has a clear title. The titles of sections are quite clear and easy to read, and the sections themselves just seem thoughtfully composed. It looks like some effort's been put into it. In terms of the content, the students has included all the sections they've been asked to include. Last year they weren't asked to do a research development section, so that's kind of missing, but they weren't asked to do that. But this year we'd expect a research development section included, and if you go to the the assessment brief on the module space, we literally tell you the specific sections you should include. So pathogenesis, epidemiology, diagnosis, treatment, and recent research developments. So all that information needs to be included. It can be included as distinct sections, so one labelled pathogenesis, one labelled epidemiology, etc. You don't have to do it that way. Just those are the things that should be discussed on the poster. Those are the areas that the poster should cover. If any one of those areas isn't discussed, so if you have a poster and there's no discussion of epidemiology or no discussion of diagnosis, then that's a flaw in the poster and you're going to lose marks for that. So if we go back to this poster we're looking at here, something else you'll notice is the use of figures. So we expect you to use figures. A good poster will almost always include figures. One weakness of this poster is the lack of exposition of these figures. There's no real explanation of what these figures mean. Ideally there would be a figure legend and a small title for each of these figures. At the moment the reader kind of just has to figure out what the figures mean for themselves, which isn't ideal. They are all referenced though, which is good. So all information on the poster should be referenced. That goes for the text and for the figures. This student's gone for Vancouver style referencing, so that's what the numbered style is basically. The numbered style is pretty good for posters because it means you use up less space. You don't have to write the surname and then et al. And then the date, which can obviously, on a poster when you're quite, you can struggle for space because you've got to fit everything you want onto this poster. It can be quite annoying when you have to do the Harvard referencing or APA or something like that. So Vancouver style, where you just use the numbers, students prefer it and I don't mind if you use it. The reference section itself, where you actually have the reference list, that needs to be included on the poster. You'll notice on this poster the references are in really small font. That's totally fine. We actually encourage it. The reference list is literally there for reference. So whilst it does need to be on the poster and you can tuck it away into the corner and you can make the font quite small, because what you'll find is when this poster is printed off, I think it's A1 or is it A0? I think it's whatever the size is, we print it off for you, but it needs to be basically visible. So I'll add some instructions specifically on the size of fonts and tell you what size the poster is eventually going to be printed off as. But basically that text just needs to be visible, and when the poster is blown up and printed off, you'll find that small text there in the references is perfectly it's legible, we can read it, which is fine. I'm not sure if there's much else to say. If you look at the content of the writing, you'll see that it's not descriptive. It's not just descriptive. There's also analysis and discussion and things like that. And that's what your poster should be like. If you look at the assessment brief, it specifically says information on the poster should be critical, as should your answers to questions. So when you include in information on the poster, it shouldn't just be a list of information. There should be some analysis. If you're talking about a diagnostic technique, you should describe the key advantages or disadvantages. You should say why it's used or why it isn't used, etc. If you're talking about epidemiology, you should explain why the statistics look the way they do, if that makes sense. And the same goes for your answers to questions. So a big portion of your mark is going to be from your ability to answer the questions we ask you, and it's going to be about your ability to discuss the poster. So the information you have on the poster is going to be the minimum of your knowledge. And what I mean by that is, if we ask you to explain anything on the poster, you should be able to go into a lot more detail than what you've included. So if you have a figure on the poster, you should be able to explain at length what that figure means, where you got it from, who produced it, how they produced it. So for example, in this epidemiology section, there's this figure of England with the different I think that's numbers of TB cases, and there's this concentration in London. So if someone had this figure, we'd want them to explain, why are there so many cases in London? Why aren't there many cases in these other regions, etc., etc.? Where is this figure from? How did the researchers who created this figure, how did they get that data, etc., etc.? Same goes for the written content. So we could read a sentence and ask you to explain that information and expand upon that information. So really, the information that's actually on the poster should just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of your knowledge. Same goes for the studies that you reference. So you should be prepared for us to ask you to explain any of the studies in your reference list. So if we see a study that catches our eye, we could ask you basically any question about the study. Basically what we want to make sure is that you haven't just taken a study and just picked out the sentence you need, or you haven't just read the abstract. We want to know you've read the study through and through, and that you actually understand the study and that you can discuss it in a critical way. And again, your answers to questions should be critical, they should be insightful. You should be showing that you're capable of kind of inventive and insightful and original ideas. So next we have a poster from the same cohort. So this was produced by another student last year. This poster is looking at human papillomavirus. It's another really good poster. So straight away, if you look at it, it looks good. They've picked a color scheme, this kind of pinky purple, and they've basically based the poster around that color scheme, which is great. Again, it's not perfect. I don't know why the banner for the title is so big. They've wasted a lot of space there. And also the formatting of the text isn't ideal. There's a lot of empty space all over this poster, really, that they could have included more information. However, these figures look great. They really look great. They have titles generally. They have bits of written information explaining what they mean. Some of them are missing bits of information, which isn't ideal. So for example, if we look at the figure of genital warts in the middle of the poster, there's no real explanation of that. It's just a photo. Not ideal. Generally what we do when we see something like that is we ask the student to explain it. And then if they can explain the figure and they can verbally give us the information that should have been on the poster, that kind of mitigates the damage done. The information is good. It's all correct. It's all referenced. This student has gone for, that's not Vancouver, it's not the numbered style, it's either Harvard or APA or something like that. So you can use that kind of reference style. The university standard is APA, but I tend to prefer Vancouver for posters, which is again just for size. It's a shame that the information is presented here as kind of bullet points. You don't really want to do that. We don't want bullet points. What you want is full paragraphs, so it needs to have a sense of flow. And if it's just bullet points, again, it's just descriptive information. So what the student did when they were questioned about this poster, they demonstrated they had a really, really deep understanding of this knowledge. So they filled in the gaps verbally, if you like. So they explained the poster well. So this poster is a good example of a poster that kind of looks good and it ticks all the boxes. But if you go into a little bit more depth, it's not quite as good as it first looks. That being said, everything's referenced. The figures visually, they look great. All the information is correct. And we've got that reference list at the bottom. So again, it's in small font, which is fine. There is a lot, as we said, a lot of wasted space, which isn't good. But it's not the end of the world. So yeah, this is a pretty good example of a poster, and the student defended this poster very well. and they ended up with a very high mark actually overall. So basically, I don't want to show any examples of bad posters because obviously some of the posters failed, some got just above 40. I think it's a bit in poor taste or a bit inappropriate or whatever to present posters that didn't do very well, that weren't good. Basically, those posters missed key elements, or they didn't target the brief. So if you have a poster that doesn't have referencing or doesn't have figures or misses out one of the sections, so it doesn't have epidemiology or it doesn't have any pathogenesis, then straight away you're going to go into the lower band of marks because you haven't a bit of it missing. It isn't complete, you know. And because a bit of it is missing, you haven't really done what you've been asked to do, if that makes sense. The brief clearly says to talk about pathogenesis, epidemiology, diagnosis, treatment, and recent research developments. So if you haven't done all those things, then you haven't done what you've been asked to do for the assessment. The same for the poster being critical. If it's overly descriptive, then again you haven't really done what you've been asked to do. Same goes for technical elements. So if there's no referencing, you haven't done what you've been asked to do. We know in scientific writing we have to reference everything. So if anything isn't referenced, that's not good. If there's no title, that's not good. So that's what a lot of the posters that scored very low had in common. Also the content as well, in terms of the content of the writing, it would be incorrect or again not referenced, or there'd be loads of spelling mistakes or grammatical mistakes and things like that, and it just seemed like it was thrown together last minute. And those are the main issues we'd have with posters. Obviously a big portion of the mark comes from your performance on the day, so I'd encourage you to put as much effort as you can kind of afford, because I know you have a billion other things to do as well, but put as much effort as you can into the poster, because if you go into the poster presentation with a good solid poster, with a poster that you're confident about and that you haven't kind of thrown together last minute, then you're going to feel good about it. You're going to feel confident answering the questions, and also because a portion of the marks are given just for the poster alone, then you're kind of giving yourself a head start, especially if you can make sure you've got a good solid mark for the poster. Then you're already kind of a step ahead, if you like, before you've even started answering any questions. In terms of submission and things like that, you need to submit it by the date provided in the brief, which is March 5th at 2 p.m. Then the medical school is going to print it off for you, and then a week later, at the poster presentation day, you'll just turn up looking smart, and your poster will be printed off on kind of a poster board, and so we'll all go into small hall and we'll all do that. You'll be assessed by two people, so two members of academic staff will assess you independently. So one person will come, then another person will come. We'll also have kind of PhD students and master students and clinical MD students and PA students walking around just generally looking at the posters. So the idea is that hopefully there'll be quite a number of people just having a look at the posters, just hopefully learning about some infectious diseases and taking on a little bit of information. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail closer to the date. For now, obviously, you need to think about putting the poster together and then getting it submitted. If you have any more questions, you can email me anytime or talk to me after lectures. I'll be happy to answer. Okay.